specialists, consultants, and our agile development team in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Russia. I was always taught to not start a presentation with an apology, but I'm going to start a presentation with an apology and say, sorry we haven't done one of these in at least 3 years. So we've lost some focus on you, and we absolutely want to focus back on you. We need your help. To give you an idea, we have 2,000 service provider accounts within the EMEA region. It's by far the most diverse region that we have. We probably have direct relationships with about 50 of them. So we absolutely need your help. The other aspect is what we're finding is we're taking technology to our customers. One of the biggest problems we're having is the customers understanding being able to implement and be successful. So it's not always about the technology, it's about the skill set that's out there. And we need your help to help our customers be successful deploying some of the technologies that we're going to be talking about. Now, where do we get this material from? I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the other events that we've ran recently before I get into the agenda. So I don't know how many of you were there, but Cisco Live for us, we had 15,000 Cisco customers in Barcelona for 5 days. And this year we had 1,600 service provider customers. Now within that, we did over 4,000 presentations. We had about 15 different demonstrations that we were taking them through. 30% more service provider customers attended Cisco Live this year, and in the previous year we had 25%. So the interest from service provider in our technologies is growing, and we're getting good engagement with them. After that, we had 100 of our Cisco engineers go to San Jose for what we call the Systems Engineering VT, where we engage directly with engineering and we hear the very latest of what's been happening. That happened last month. And then we had Mobile World Congress 2 weeks ago, where we had 26 different demonstrations and over 800 executive meetings. The reason I'm explaining this is a lot of the presentations that you're going to see in the next 3 days come directly from those interactions with the customers and those conversations around the technology and the challenges. So we're very happy to take you through that. As we go through, it's great we've got everybody in the room. Thank you for coming physically. And it's fantastic for everybody who's joining us on WebEx and telepresence as well. I'm very happy to take questions as we go through. If you're in the room, just put your hand up or shout out. Challenge me. If I put something up that you think's wrong, I'm very happy to get your feedback. Similarly on the WebEx, you can ask questions on the WebEx. We will be monitoring it. And at the end, if I have time, we'll have a quick look and we'll see if there's anything that we can answer for you then. So what do we want to go through? A little look at the service provider market. There have been some challenges in the service provider market, and the service provider market is very broad. From a Cisco perspective, we include media, over-the-top, connectivity providers, converged providers. So it's a very broad set of customers. Then I want to go straight into 5G. Everybody's talking about 5G. The hype is incredible. It's definitely not here yet. But when is it really going to kick in? How can you be successful? What sort of business models should we be looking at? Then I will touch on some of the technologies that you're going to hear about in the next 3 days. So I'll have a look at SP networking. We'll have a look at telco data center and IT data center and how they're coming together. And we'll finish off with B2B or SP channels. So how do we enable service providers to send those end services? Okay, so a little look at the service provider market. So this is taken from GSMA Intelligence. And this is looking at our top 7 customers within Europe. And this is showing their average revenue per user over the last 10 years. And I know there's a lot of lines on the chart. I will clean it up for you in a second. But if you look around here, this is where 4G was launched. And what you can see is the dramatic drop in their ARPU. 4G did not deliver more profitability. The billions of dollars that were spent on spectrum did not deliver on an increase in revenue. They did keep service providers extremely relevant, and they did keep customers satisfied with throughput, etc., in that space. If we just look at the average, and bear in mind this isn't all the service providers, this is just the top 7 in their home countries. But in the first 5 years of deploying 4G, the ARPU dropped by 32%. In some countries, it was up to 70%. Around the same time, we saw Europe bring in the rules around roaming, and your packages were the same wherever that you went. So that had a big hit on our service provider customers. The good news is, in the last 3.5 years, most of them have stabilized their ARPU or have started to grow again. So they're getting back into a stronger position within that space, and they're getting ready to make the investments around 5G. And that's why when we're having the conversations with our customers, 5G is where everybody's looking to save money to make sure that they're investing on that infrastructure and getting it right. The second thing is around fixed. So mobility is one of the areas that is absolutely important and has been driving profitability within that space, even though we saw that dramatic drop within ARPU. This is looking at the last 3 years, and this is public data taken from Netflix. You can go in, you can look by country, you can look by service provider. And this is the busy hour performance of a stream on Netflix on those networks. And this is the same set of customers that we're looking at here. And you can see some have improved. They've all been trending upwards. If you go further back, it was significantly lower when you look further back. But going by Netflix, they're saying you need 5 megabits per second to stream HD. And as you can see, most of them are coming in at about 3.5 megabits per second. And over that period, if you look at the subscriber growth, it's been huge. So actually, they've been doing a good job of trying to stay ahead of the curve on their investments. But the key thing here is it's all about fiber infrastructure. They've all got plans to roll out fiber infrastructure, not only for fixed, but fixed is extremely important. But when we start to look at 5G, we're going to be connecting the radio with 25 gig interfaces. So we're no longer bundling E1s or even talking about fast Ethernet or GigE. 25 gig interfaces coming directly out of the radios, coupled with this growth on the fixed. Now, those that have been successful on the ARPU are those that are offering converged services. And what I mean by that is where you start to bundle your fixed line fiber with your mobile handsets and with video services, either their own video services or just repackaging Netflix, Amazon, etc. Moody released a report 2 months ago on who's going to be successful within 5G. And they estimated it's going to be at least 5 years before we start to see an uptick in the profitability. But those that are going to be successful are those that are investing in fiber now. So you have to have deep fiber in the network to be successful within this space. So why have I been through that? Why is that so important to us? Well, that fiber needs a network. And this is all going to be about who's got the most cost-effective, high-throughput network that they can automate and reduce their OpEx to run. And that's why we talk so much about the network. In addition to that, the data centers that are running all of that software, centralized to begin with, but then becoming distributed. All of that is where we play. And from a mobility perspective, in the packet core, the heart of the network, that's absolutely where we play. So the good thing is, our service providers are in a good position to go and invest. They have to roll out the fiber. That's a lot of civil works. That's a lot of investment. But at the same time, they have to upgrade those networks. So what are the service providers trying to do? And I know our service provider customers would hate some of these terminologies. Pipe is a horrible term. But if you want to be successful in that, and most of our service providers, you have to be the best and most cost-efficient provider of connectivity. That is the core business model, and it's still going to be the core business model. If you are not the most cost-efficient per bit service provider, everything else that you want to do on top of that doesn't count. And that is still a very valid business model, and a lot of our customers, that's absolutely where they will be focusing. But those that are going to be really successful are those that go after additional services. Now, we've seen service providers move to try and become media companies and own content, and that's been successful for some in the short term. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out longer term. But when we look at things like the business market, moving into those new verticals, when we look at IoT, That's where they can really add the value with the connectivity, but enabling this as a platform going forward. And we'll come back to that when we talk about 5G. But the other aspect to this is if we look at the value chain and what's happened over the last 5, 7 years, is a lot of the value has gone either to the over-the-top players or to the handset players and the apps on the handsets. They've increased their capture of wallet share and have moved into new areas. That's not necessarily where the service providers have been successful. But the service providers that will be successful will make sure that they're definitely the best platform for the over-the-top and the experienced providers to run on top of. So bringing those two areas together is going to be critical. And when we start to have the conversation about mobile edge compute, when we start to talk about caching deep within the network, when we start to look at optimization and how we can do zero billing and all of these things within the packet core on some of these elements, it's those that bring those two together successfully that are going to make the biggest splash within this market. So finally, on the introduction, where are Cisco relevant within this? So I wanted to be absolutely clear where we're targeting and what are the key areas for us. So we do about $4 billion of revenue in EMEA across this space. About half of that is B2B. So selling enterprise services with our service provider partners to end customers. We tend to call it SP channel. B2B, SP channel, there's lots of different ways of terminating. That's over on the right-hand side. In addition to that, if our customers want to be successful within this space, we talk about the flexibility that 5G should bring. The ability to launch new services, the ability to get things out there in weeks or months rather than planning something for 18 months before you do a launch. The only way that they can keep pace with that is if their own enterprise, internal way of running their business can keep pace with it. So they have to digitize themselves. A lot of our service provider customers have a lot of shops. They have physical interaction with their customers, but increasingly they're moving online as how you interact online, etc. But if you want to launch a new service, you need the billing, you need the customer support, you need everything at the back end to be able to do that in the right way. The digitization of our service providers from an enterprise perspective, we look at that from a service provider perspective within Cisco, but really it's our enterprise technologies. There's not a lot of difference to the positioning that we do with our big enterprise customers. The key difference, though, is one, they have a big WAN network. So it's no good going in and talking to them about SD-WAN and saying, you don't need MPLS VPNs anymore. That message doesn't go down very well. So there's some difference in the positioning. Similarly, in office locations, they have a big mobile network. So when you talk about Wi-Fi and you talk about offloading the mobile network, again, that's not a conversation that goes down particularly well. So the technology is just as relevant, but the way that we position it is slightly different within that environment. So that's over on the right-hand side on digitization. Then on the left-hand side, this may be the area that more of you are working in. I'm not sure the exact breakdown of everybody that we've got here, but we break that down into networks. Now, networks is a very broad term. This is optical, cable, core edge, access and aggregation. This is mobile packet core. And this is all the automation and orchestration that goes on top of it. So a very broad term for everything that we capture within that space. And then on the right-hand side, data center. Now there's two buying centers. You'll hear a lot more about this in the coming days. There's the IT data center that's running the business, and then there's the telco data center. As we see workloads move towards software running in the cloud, we're seeing perhaps a flatlining on the IT data center, but the telco data center is where we're seeing all the plans to invest and drive that growth as we move towards software-based applications. So that was a little introduction to what we're seeing in the market. It's good news. We're seeing the investments coming. If our service providers aren't profitable in what they're doing, then that's not good news for us, and we absolutely want to enable them to do that. Anybody got any questions at that point? I'm going to pause. I know it's early. You don't have to. I'm going to pause at the end of each section, so don't worry. If there's nobody's got a question, but if anybody does or wants to challenge any of it, or if we have anything on the WebEx, I'm happy to take questions as we go through. So that's the service provider market. What about 5G and the hype around 5G? Started probably 5 or 6 years ago by vendors. I mean, it's very important, this cycle of upgrades that goes on within the networks. If you look at the profitability of certain vendors, they rely heavily on refreshing radios, which is about 70% of the CapEx spend. So if these migrations and these upgrades don't happen, that causes a problem. It's much broader than that, and 5G is actually encompassing all of the technology changes and all of the innovation that we've seen coming over the last 10 years. SDN, NFV, containerization, the move towards software-based infrastructure, the distribution of the data center. Yes, it's going to have a new radio that comes with it, but it's really that move towards an all IP-based infrastructure that's software-based that's key about 5G. Before I come on to 5G, where are we in 4G? We're not in radio. We're not in that 70% of the CapEx spend that goes and puts this out in the market. Where we are is in packet core. Now, depending on which analyst you go and talk to, and all vendors use their own favorite analyst who come up with various figures. This is our favorite analyst. And for 4G, and quite rightly when I show you some of the figures of what's going on, particularly within the Americas, we have 33% market share. 90 deployments worldwide. So we're the biggest 4G packet core vendor. And that's where policy, that's where legal intercept, that's where billing, that's where we apply control to the traffic, etc., within that network. So we're at the heart of most of the infrastructure that's out there today. So when we start to talk about 5G and the relevance to 5G, I'll show you as we go through, and you'll hear more about this later in the week again, we're moving towards fully software virtualization within that space. And the upgrade from 4G to 5G will be software upgrades on existing infrastructure in a lot of those cases. And I hinted at some of this, but I just wanted to look at a little bit of the history of going through the generations in mobility. So 3G, it's about when I started my networking career with Cisco, so it's a long time ago. It was all going to be about video calling. And that's the Motorola handset that was going to get us all video calling. Huge spectrum auctions, spectacular figures that we saw in the press at the time of our service provider customers investing within that space. Big infrastructure spends, build the infrastructure, they will come. Nobody wanted it. Some of those companies really struggled. The infrastructure was built out for one or two services, and those services weren't successful. What really saved it was the BlackBerry and the iPhone that came along, and people started to drive revenue on those networks. That was 5 or 6 years later, but fortunately, that started to drive the data on 3G. The 3G networks couldn't cope, did the upgrade to 4G, we got the mobile internet. It was a significant change in the radio and the packet core technology. We got VoLTE, so we got to true voice over IP on the infrastructure. The business model didn't really change any. It was just more of the same to the end user, but they had the smartphones to actually drive the capacity on those networks. So what's going to be successful in 5G? And if anybody saw some of the news, or if you were at Mobile World Congress, everybody was showing what 5G was going to be delivering, what services, what was going to be successful. The truth is, we don't know. We absolutely don't know which ones of those are going to be successful. But the key is, you have to build the infrastructure, so when we find the one, and I'm sure there's some out there, you can grow and rapidly capture that and be successful within that market. So it's all about flexibility within that infrastructure. It's about building a digital platform you can launch new services on. If they're successful, expand them. If they're not, get them off the network, reuse the infrastructure. It's getting a little old now, this European Commission report, but it does show very nicely what's the expectation and the new markets for 5G. And if you look on the left-hand side, I know it's a little bit small, the big blue ring is consumer. And in consumer are also business users using handsets within that space. But the vast majority of the revenue off those networks is consumer handsets. That's going to be very relevant to maintain the current revenue streams in 5G. But the growth, if you want to grow, you need to move into new markets. And that's really moving into enterprise and moving into IoT. So providing those services to digitize those end customers. And we'll come back to this as we go through in all the different elements of what we're seeing. Typically today, depending on which large service provider you look at, we call them tier ones, but the big multinationals that we have based within Europe, they can be making 8% of their revenue out of business customers, even the ones that are most successful at it. So it's still relatively small. The key thing is they're extremely profitable for them. That 8% drives significant revenue for them, whereas consumers, the margins can be extremely small. So if they can achieve this, if they can achieve growth in those new verticals, that will make them significantly more profitable. So what's our solution within this space? We do everything but the radio. So we're building out a digital platform, software enabled, and that's what you're going to hear about over the coming days. And on top of that, we can deploy all of those different services, be they infrastructure-based services, be they end consumer services, or be they B2B type services. One of the big problems our service providers have is the way that they run their networks today is very OpEx intensive and takes a lot of people. Now, we've worked a lot with the web and the over-the-top providers, and in fact, when we started engaging with them, we were in completely different worlds from an automation, orchestration, openness perspective. And we've learned a lot, and we've had to change significantly. But what we know is they can have somebody at a terminal or somebody working who's managing 20,000 virtual machines or even more, 20,000 servers with virtual machines on top of them. In the service provider space, you may have a ratio in the core of the network of one person to 20 or 50 boxes. In the access and aggregation, typically it's much more efficient, but still, we have to make operationally this infrastructure much better to work, and that's why you're going to hear a lot about automation. The other aspect is around security, both securing the end users, but securing every element within the infrastructure to allow you to do this. And with a number of different ways, we're building security both from secure boot for the platform itself, but also how do we monitor the network to make sure that the expected behavior is going on. So just a little bit more detail on what that looks like. First of all, it's any access, and we're going to keep adding access technologies. I'll come on to Wi-Fi version 6 in a minute, but if we look at narrowband IoT, if we look at LoRa, we have fiber out there today, PON, but we're going to probably be going more towards direct fiber into the infrastructure. You've got to have this. You can't build out different infrastructure every time that you add a new access technology. The access and aggregation, I mentioned about the investment that's needed in fiber, particularly in mobility. A lot of those endpoints in rural areas are still based on microwave. So there's going to be a huge transition in the aggregation space, and that's absolutely where we play. And the cost reduction in the cost per bit is so significant, and the change and the churn that's needed within those networks. You would have hoped if you were putting some of this in, particularly if it was SDH or ATM in the past, that you would be leaving that infrastructure in there for 5, 7, 10 years. Now, from a technology perspective, typically we're seeing a churn every 3 years within that space, just to keep up with the price point and stay competitive. And then the data center. The data center is very centralized today, and it still is. There's a lot of talk about mobile edge compute. There's a lot of talk about distributing, and we'll show you that some operators are really starting to move in that direction. But today, it's very centralized, but we're going to move to a fully distributed data center and workload approach. And I'm showing virtual network functions. That's absolutely what's out and in the network today. We're going to move towards containerization. The reason that the containerization and cloud native is important is it gives you the flexibility to run these things anyway. But there's 2 directions that this is going to move in. Some of those workloads, if it makes sense from the service perspective, will move out towards the edge of the network. If you need low latency, if you need high availability, then we will move this out. When we talk about mobile edge compute, that's absolutely the market for 5G that's looking at these low latency type services. But it only makes sense to do that if you can charge your customers more for it. So we're not going to do that for everything. Power, space, the types of locations that this is going to be deployed in, is going to be more expensive than doing centralized services. On the other hand, for some of these applications, we're going to move things into the cloud and move right on the right-hand side. We have, with Telenor Working Group 2, who've spun up a complete 4G packet core with all the elements that you need to run that, and it's running in Amazon Web Services. We announced it at Mobile World Congress. So if you want to run an MVNO, or you want to go out and launch a mobile network extremely quickly, there's no reason that you can't run that all out of Amazon Web Services or any other public cloud provider. But there's disadvantages to that. You're not going to be doing low latency services. You may not be compliant with GDPR and security regulations within your country. So there's different models for different types of services. And then over the top of that, we run all of these services as software. It becomes a software business. And you'll see that we're innovating in hardware. We're making sure that we have those platforms that can most effectively go after this market. But a lot of the innovation, a lot of the change in the model, a lot of the way that we and you engage with your customers is all going to be around software. So as we go through, I wanted to pull out some of the recent press announcements and try and make some of this discussion real to show that we are actually doing this with customers, that it's not just PowerPoint, that we're looking at where we'd like to go. So one of the announcements that we did, we did this back in September, was around T-Mobile. So we've been working with T-Mobile US to deploy our 4G virtual packet core out across that infrastructure. And over the last 3 years, that's been fully deployed, and we now have 70 million subscribers on a fully virtualized packet core running within that environment. And as I said, one of the key things for them is they've built this out in a way that when they do the upgrade to 5G, and we're running 5G trials with them today, it's just a matter of them using the software, upgrading to the latest release, and adding those radios out on the edge. I oversimplify, but you see they have the infrastructure ready to be able to deploy that and go out there. But the move to virtualization, this isn't a small trial, this isn't something that's just within one region, that's all of their customers operating within this infrastructure. And from a 5G perspective, we're involved in many trials across EMEA, and there's a couple that I wanted to point out. I've already mentioned Telenor and Working Group 2, and all of these are public examples that you can use with your customers who are running a fully virtualized packet core out of AWS so as they can deploy services as MVNOs anywhere across EMEA, or anywhere worldwide, to be honest. But there's a very nice use case and video available on YouTube of the Orange Romania 5G fixed wireless access trial that we ran, where we had Meraki endpoints. It was a Cisco virtualized packet core, Samsung 5G radios, and we were using 5G to provide fixed line services in areas where there wasn't much fiber, and getting extremely high speeds into those households who were using that within that environment. And then the other one we'll come back to when we start talking about segment routing with Vodafone, was Vodafone deployed segment routing in Germany. They were running a trial of remotely driven cars. So it's one thing for automated and self-driving cars. This was driving a car remotely across the network, and we were using segment routing to make sure that we could get extremely low latency and make sure that that got the type of services that was needed to actually go out and deploy. So that was a little on 5G. I just wanted to touch on Wi-Fi because we do get this question a lot from our customers. And if Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei are discussing with our customers, they will often say, well, Wi-Fi is going to become irrelevant. Don't need Wi-Fi, everything's going to go 5G. I think some of the same things were said about 4G when 4G was launched. So that didn't pan out. Now, 5G defines many different access technologies, and one of the access technologies is Wi-Fi. And we're going to be looking, and I'll show you in a minute, how we're going to be integrating Wi-Fi as an access technology. Now, if you're talking a shipping port, or you want to do something on trains to manage the train systems, if you're doing something where you want to download telemetry from aircraft as they come onto the canopy of a runway, absolutely, that is a sweet spot for 5G. where you need very high security, you need very good coverage, and you need very high throughput. But if you're in carpeted areas, if you're in shopping malls, and you want to provide IoT-type services to everything, if you look at the number of devices, I think there was a study in the US, the average household has 20 Wi-Fi connected devices. We all carry many different Wi-Fi connected devices. The cost of a 5G chipset, with all the licenses that you have to pay for the patents and everything else, is at least tenfold that of a Wi-Fi chipset. So 5G is going to be relevant, but it's going to sit alongside Wi-Fi, and the both will be used by different types of connected devices within that. And the reason I wanted to show this, you may be familiar with Wi-Fi version 6. We're just starting to see this come out. What's important about it? Well, first of all, the codec over the air is the same as used in 4G. The reason that's important is when you get in crowded areas on Wi-Fi today, the performance can go down when we try to do very high density of users on it. Because of the codec that we're using over the air, we'll be able to get much better performance in very crowded areas, and we'll be able to do much more reliable connectivity to you as a user. Obviously, you get higher throughput, but the other thing you do, because we're using the codecs that we used in 4G, you get much better power management. So the drain that you'll get on your battery is significantly less as to the way that Wi-Fi works. But the other thing that we're going to be doing, and we had this on our stand at Mobile World Congress, I have to confess I'm not sure if we've publicly announced this yet, but we definitely had this on our stand and we're showing it to everybody at Mobile World Congress. Open roaming. What do we mean by that? Well, the possibility for those who've deployed Cisco Wi-Fi to enable open roaming, an SSID that will allow, if you had an agreement with any of the big mobile operators, when they go into the building, they will SIM authenticate directly onto the Wi-Fi infrastructure. So that allows you, as an enterprise customer, to effectively provide access and guest access to anybody who walks into the building, making the Wi-Fi infrastructure a good offload point for 5G. Now, as I say, 5G will absolutely, in industrial applications, in mining and large deployments, will be extremely relevant, and that's definitely one of the target areas. But this will make Wi-Fi in these types of environments extremely relevant as well. Okay, so that was 5G, and I just ended a little bit now on Wi-Fi because we often get that question. Anybody got any questions on 5G? Great, thank you.
Hello. Maybe the question is not related to 5G in specific, but mainly related to the strategy that Cisco is currently adopting for not having an access part for the mobile domain. I mean, mainly the radio. I can see in the Middle East that this is a major showstopper for Cisco for deploying the mobile packet core part, especially large vendors like Huawei or Ericsson are trying to bundle the core part with the radio part, and the most of the money here in the radio part. So when it comes to buy or selling the mobile packet core part, it becomes peanuts beside the radio part.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's an excellent question. You're not from Cisco? Yes. You're not from Cisco? I'm not. No. It's a very good tee-up question. No, you're absolutely right. And that's what they will practically give away the core of the network. Yeah. And that's hard to compete. Free is very hard to compete against. The thing is, if anything, the way that you deployed 3G and 4G was you'd have the have the packet core, you'd divide up the country, and half the country you'd deploy with one radio vendor and half the country you'd deploy with the other. You certainly wouldn't mix radios within an environment, and you very much kept them very structured the way that you deployed. So the radio hasn't really been disrupted. When we look at all of the disruption that's happened, certainly to us in this space, and you look at everything else has been disrupted, the radio is still a monolithic thing that you go out and you deploy within that space. 5G is the opportunity to build out a new network. Now, if you look at 5G non-standalone, which is one of the architectures, you're really bolting a 5G radio onto 4G. What a great strategy to keep you relevant as a radio vendor. Bolt it onto the existing, and then we'll slowly migrate you onto the, onto my radios. You'll see an example I'm going to show, and hopefully this will really answer your question, with Rakuten, where we've completely broken out the radio. And so what I'm getting at is they need to drive multi-vendor. And buying that all off one vendor, including the packet core, is absolutely not going to drive multi-vendor. One of the scare tactics they're using is to say, you need to be first to market. We'll make you first to market. You can make the big splash, but you need to give it all to us because then there's lower risk. Well, everybody can't be first to market. So that is going to die down extremely quickly because everybody's claiming that they have live and deployed networks now. What's key is building out this infrastructure in a way that transforms their cost per bit and their ability to launch new services. So that's not an easy conversation, but with the market share that you can see that we already have in packet core for 4G, we will work with any vendor. So be it Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, ZTE, we will be the packet core for that infrastructure, and we'll work with them on some of the new entrants with Open vRAN to disrupt. Thank you for the question. That's a very good question. Okay. Right. Any other questions? Okay. Now, so I'm going to go through SP networking, data center, and B2B. Extremely high level, just to give you a few of the touch points, because in each of these areas, you're going to get a lot more detail as we go through. And in each of the areas, I'll show a few customer examples. So SP networking. I just wanted to touch on some of the areas of innovation and the disruption that we've been going through over the last 5 to 7 years. And we've completely changed. If you'd come to us, or even 5 years ago, and said, well, I want to deploy on white box, or why aren't you using more merchant silicon, or I want you to open up the APIs in your operating system and I want to run third-party code within your operating system, we'd have politely said, thank you, that's an interesting idea, but this is what we've got over here. And it would have been very vertically integrated. We've completely changed the way that we will engage and the way that we will co-develop with you to look at what's best to do within that market. And I'm saying that from a service provider perspective, but as partners, we rely on you to help us to enable this and do this in the right way. So we're innovating in hardware. So we absolutely are the #1 specialist ASIC vendor within this space. But also we're working with Broadcom merchant silicon vendors to make sure that if the feature set that you need is right and the performance that you need, absolutely, we will provide that as a platform. And we'll also run on x86 or even on white box. So all of those deployment models are there. The other thing that you're probably going to hear a little bit more about later on when we talk about optical is we're in the DWDM space, we're in the optical space. In EMEA, we probably have, we have 3% market share. So we're not big within that space. We are bigger in the metro and in the enterprise and how we deploy within that space. But what's going to become more and more important is the optics component of those router platforms. When we start going towards 400 gig, they start to become 50% or more of the bill of materials. So the strategy as to how you build out that infrastructure and how you use those opticals is going to become more and more important. Similarly, we're probably going to see more disruption in the way that DWDM infrastructure is being built out. We can now do a transponder in a pluggable. So we can do DWDM directly out of the router platform. And you'll hear when we start looking at access and aggregation, that completely transforms the sort of capacity that we can get and the sort of deployment models that you can see. So a lot of innovation going on in hardware. In software, iOS XR across the whole of our platform, from the access and aggregation into the core, into the edge, into the peering. We used to have a mix of different, in some environments, we do have different operating systems, but we're really standardizing on iOS XR. The way that we're innovating on iOS XR, I mentioned about running third-party code, the way that we've opened up the APIs, the way that we can stream telemetry. That's a key differentiator across all of our different platforms. But also the way that you consume that software and engage with us is different as well. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. I mentioned about open, and this is one of our key differentiators when we look at some of our competitors within this space, is we absolutely want to tell you everything about how the box works. We want to enable our customers, our partners, to be able to build and innovate on top of this. So it's no longer go in and do some CLI. We will give you access via the APIs to everything that's going on within that platform and allow you to innovate on top of it. And finally, automation. We continue to make significant investments in this space. There's different levels that we can look at of automation, and we have misstepped in the past, but I think we're getting now a very strong automation and orchestration portfolio that runs on top of this, even to the point where we're now using that internally in our testing environments to test our own code and use automation to run that. So I mentioned this already, but just to be clear, so we can give you iOS XR to run on an x86 platform. That may absolutely be applicable in certain environments, to run that all the way out on the edge of the network, to run that on utility compute, or maybe there's a function that you want to run as a control plane. And this is really where this can become applicable, is a control plane function where you don't need high I/O and throughput. I'm looking over on the left-hand side here. Think of route reflector or segment routing based SDN, etc. The control plane function can be applicable there. Now, we can all go out and do huge figures of throughput on x86 that we can get going through a box. If you need an advanced feature set, if you want to be doing policy, if you want to be doing classification, if you want to be streaming telemetry, the power consumption, the space, and the number of ports that you need to actually drive that just becomes unfeasible because of the amount of racks that you're going to need to do it. So yes, we could claim, oh, well, yeah, you can do everything on x86. But when you do the business case for it, when you look at the TCO, when you look at the power, when you look at the space, it simply doesn't cost in. If your customers don't believe it and they want to go down that route, we'll have that conversation. But, you know, there's applicability, but it certainly doesn't fit into all those environments. Then over on the right-hand side, our custom ASIC-based platforms. This is where we take the advantages of the software and we take the advantages of everything that we can build into our ASICs to give you very high performance and there is a cost associated with that. But certainly in the edge of the network, in peering and in certain locations, it absolutely makes sense. And within EMEA, the ASR 9K is our biggest selling platform. And it absolutely is. That's where we're making the investment. That's where we're releasing the new cards. And that is the core platform that we have in place, and we're continuing to investment and keep that relevant. I've got the NCS 600 and the CRS, but they're being phased out, obviously. And then in the middle, we have merchant silicon type platforms. Now, this is where we can reach very interesting price points. This is where the cost per bit and those interfaces, and at Mobile World Congress, we announced on these platforms 400 gig. But when we start talking about access and aggregation, we can absolutely position these as a very cost-effective. You get all of the features and functionality and innovation within the software, coupled with very low cost per bit of that merchant silicon. The important thing is, don't ask us for all of the feature set that we've got on the ASR 9K on these platforms, because you won't get the performance, you won't get the feature set that you need. So when we're positioning these, when we're having that conversation, we talk about simplification. There's a trade-off. If you want that high performance, you need to optimize. And what you'll see is in some of our customers, we're going to IPv6 everywhere, and we're doing segment routing on top. But don't take the whole feature set, the ASR 9K, and say, well, I need that on the NCS, because you're not going to get it. It's a different price point box, it's different silicon, different level of performance. But certainly in access and aggregation and some peering applications, that's exactly what you're going to hear about, and we're having a lot of success and wins in that access and aggregation space. So that's a little bit about the hardware, and you're going to hear a lot more about that as the week goes on. Just a comment about segment routing. So segment routing was a Cisco innovation. Clarence Fils, you'll see him talking at Cisco Live, etc., but all the rest of the team. So segment routing allows us to do source-based routing. And in the past, we've looked at things like MPLS VPN and traffic engineering. And absolutely, at the time, that was very relevant, what we were trying to achieve, how we were trying to go out and do that within the network. But when you wanted to scale that, it was extremely complicated. And when we started to layer BGP, MPLS traffic engineering, MPLS VPNs, all on top of each other, the networks became complicated. Not within one domain, but if you wanted to open up that domain from the access, the aggregation, the core, the edge, What we ended up doing was putting boundaries in so we had them in manageable areas. With segment routing, we can now really start to scale that network so we don't need those boundaries and we can have it as one single domain. But the key thing is it allows us to do things like latency-based traffic engineering within the network. So what do I mean by that? When we talk in 5G about network slicing and us providing particular traffic profiles within the network, we can now say, well, anything coming in with this traffic profile, we want to go across the network with this SLA, and segment routing really allows us to put that in the network. Now, that's not for everything. Some traffic we're going to give low latency. Other, we might be looking at capacity. Others, we might want effectively what was fast reroute or quick restoration within that network. Now, when we talk about SDN enabling the infrastructure, this is exactly what we're doing with segment routing. So we have our controller, our XTC, or I don't know if the name's changed now, but that allows us to have and set up these paths across the whole of the infrastructure. So this is a key element of innovation that we're driving across our whole portfolio within the access and aggregation. And the other one, and we have a session later today on this, is just the way that you consume the software. So we're moving away from perpetual licensing, where you bought the box, you bought the software on top of it, you bought some support, but the software you owned and had for the perpetuity of that platform. What we're doing is we're moving to a subscription-based model. The advantage is that you get a much lower cost of insertion. So when you initially put that in, you only consume the services and the ports that you need. And then as you grow and you add more ports, you buy more licenses to enable that within the infrastructure. The other thing is we give you access to the innovation within the software. So as we bring out new features, you can enable those as quickly as you want to on that infrastructure. And it's linked in with that support model. But the other thing is, when you have those subscription licenses, they're portable as well. So if you deploy a platform today, but then in the future you move over to a different platform, you can port those licenses onto those new platforms. And we have an example I'm going to come on to in a minute, where a large international provider deployed their platforms. When they went out, they only bought the ports that they needed to use, but when they wanted to bring on a new customer, they'd buy 2 licenses, and they'd decide where they wanted to light it up within the infrastructure. And then a little bit about automation. So I'm sure you'll have heard about NSO and what we're doing from an NSO, from an infrastructure manager, moving away from using CLI and allowing us to look at what's the workflow that we need within the network, what's the services that we want to deploy, and how do we automate that. That's a fully multi-vendor enabled management platform for this infrastructure or automation platform. One of the things it doesn't do, though, is give you telemetry and insights off the infrastructure as to what's the performance that you're seeing, are there any problems within the network, etc. So we announced a while ago now, but Crossworks is a number of different orchestration platforms that come together to allow us to take insights off the network, look at what's going on, look at where you've got faults, and look at correcting those a lot quicker. So we're moving towards an orchestration platform. NSO is what we use to actually push config down and make changes to the network, and Crossworks is what we use to pull the information off the network and get insights and make the correct decisions about what we need to do. So 2 customer examples on service provider networking. The first one I wanted to look at was Colt, and we announced the win with Colt 18 months ago. And this is all based on the NCS 5K. So the platform that I was talking about around cost optimization and how we can get a very low cost per bit, but with all the control plane features and functionalities that you get within iOS XR. They provide connectivity services to third parties on a big international network. It's a mixture of the NCS, the Edge's ASR 9K, but they were looking at this market. They're very successful, and they disrupted the market by going out, and instead of doing fractional GigE, they're going out and saying, well, we can do GigE and 10 GigE, and our infrastructure is ready for it today. But what they wanted to do is start to go after the 5G connectivity market. So what they've done is they've implemented segment routing, they've orchestrated it end-to-end, and they've opened up their APIs so they can discuss with other service providers and mobility providers how they can provide connectivity services and SLAs across their infrastructure. The second example, and this we announced last year, but I'll explain why I think this one is so important. So there's not that many greenfield deployments that are still being done. What we mean by that is often it's an upgrade from 2G to 3G to 4G, or somebody has DSL and they start to add fiber to it. Reliance Jio in India wanted to go in and disrupt the India market. India was one of the last markets to release their 4G licenses. So they were a new entrance into that market, and they partnered with Cisco as the integrator to pull that whole network together. So we didn't provide the radios, but we provided just about every other element that went within that infrastructure for fixed and mobile. The interesting thing was they were adding, once that network was up and running, 10 million subscribers a month, up to 160 million subscribers on a new mobile 4G infrastructure. We were running that network for them. We were deploying that network. The sorts of volumes were huge. So they've got 250,000 Cisco routers in the network. So when we talk about scale and automation, we built out the automation and orchestration solution on the products that we've just been discussing, particularly around NSO, so as they can deploy that, scale that, and run that network very effectively. Okay, so that was a little bit on SP routing. Any questions on SP routing? No? Okay.
We have a question on the panel on WebEx from Amos Rosenbaum. What about label stack depth limitations on some of the platforms as a barrier to segment routing deployments?
Limitations on segment routing?
Yeah. What about label stack depth limitations on some of the platforms as a barrier to segment routing deployments?
Now, fortunately, our director for our portfolio was sat there until 2 minutes ago. So, oh, you're there, great. I can comment, but have you got a mic on?
Once I get it up and running, we good?
So the question was, thank you whoever asked the question, what about a label stack on segment routing on some of our platforms? And I think you're talking about the depth of the label stack that we can achieve at the edge and how we scale.
Yep. So I think it's actually very similar to what you described earlier, which is platforms like ASR 9K are kind of somewhat limitless in their ability to support, large-scale label stacks and features at scale. Some of the merchant portfolio that we've built, although there are limitations in label stack depth, we're working directly with the vendors of the chipsets to actually extend those. So even some of the limitations we have in today's 5500 and 500 portfolio, we're extending that label stack to 10, 12 labels moving forward. And future chipsets coming from those vendors also increase that label stack. So for kind of infinite programmability and flexibility, we have stuff like 9K, and then we're working on enhancing the 5500 portfolio as we speak.
Great, thank you. And that comes back to this point about when you're looking at how you design the networks, take into account some of these limitations on some of the platforms when you look at the sort of areas that you want to actually deploy. Because that's where it's when we try to make these networks very large and very flat that becomes important. Okay, so I'm going to speed up a little bit on these next two sections. So what about data center? We talk about this move towards software and software-based infrastructure. That all runs on data center. Two models that we deploy in the IT space. We have, it shifts around, but close to 50% market share in data center switching. Depending on which compute platform you look at, we're not as big, let's say, in commodity compute, but we're very successful, particularly actually in telco cloud, on what we do on UCS. But on the left-hand side, we have an IT-centric stack. It's all based on ACI, Nexus, and what we can do with Cloud Center. And within that, the Vim can be OpenStack, but to be honest, within that space, it's typically VMware. And on the right-hand side, we look at telco cloud. And for telco cloud, our service provider customers have been driving very hard around OpenStack. We have a partnership with Red Hat, a very good relationship with Red Hat. If Red Hat deploy directly, then we will support that, and we will have that within our infrastructure. But we also have a Cisco Vim. So we take Red Hat, We test that, we validate that, we add tools to make sure that it's deployable, and we look at that when it's running the different Cisco workloads. So our recommended approach within this space is CVIM, the Cisco Vim, Cisco Red Hat, and then we use our orchestration and automation tools to run that within the infrastructure. Today, almost all of the applications that are running in that space are virtual network functions. Within those VNS, some of the management functions are containerized, but they're still VNS running within that infrastructure. Now the question is, where do you position what? And with the drive towards mobile edge compute, what makes the most sense? Well, we've done a lot of work. We talk a lot about multi-cloud. And what do we mean by multi-cloud? And we have many different attempts at how we were going to be relevant in this market and what was going to be happening. What we mean by multi-cloud is our customers, a lot of the workloads have moved to either the public cloud or SaaS vendors. Huge amounts of those workloads are now consumed from the public cloud. But with GDPR, with low latency, with some of these other requirements, they will absolutely be running a lot of very, very relevant workloads within their own cloud. And increasingly, we're going to see that cloud distribute out towards the edge. So what we mean by multi-cloud is building this in a way that you can provide the same performance, the same policy, the same security, the same automation, and move those workloads to wherever it makes the most sense. And we build all of that on top of ACI. So this ACI Anywhere allows us to distribute with remote leaf, but also to virtualize and move ACI into the public cloud and have the same look and feel for those workloads across that whole piece end to end. Within that, I mentioned automation, and the automation stack is very similar with NSO as the orchestrator that runs across everything within that and Cloud Center. But I just wanted to talk about service assurance and security. So we acquired AppDynamics 18 months ago. AppDynamics allows you to monitor the end-to-end performance of the application and every element that it runs through within the infrastructure and out to the data center. But if you like, it runs on top. It's embedded within the software, not within the infrastructure. So it's very quick for us to deploy, but we've had engagements with customers who've said, we know that at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, you know, if you're working in the banking trade and you have your application, they have huge volumes of requests going on across the network. And they need to understand how that's performing and how they can optimize their infrastructure. And AppDynamics allows them to do that. On the security side, we have StealthWatch. And what StealthWatch allows us to do is to look at what is the normal behavior. We take net flow and information out of the network and we look at what's the normal profile, the normal behavior within the network. When we start talking about 5G, everything starts to go towards open APIs, HTML, and the way that this whole thing interacts and deploys is going to be very IP-centric. So we look at what's the profile, what should be talking to who, what sort of traffic levels, what sort of signaling. We monitor it, and if we see a nominal behavior, we can then take action to remediate it. So what about mobile edge compute? We are seeing this distribution, but typically we're seeing operators look at going from 4 or 8 centralized sites, pushing out to maybe 20 or 50 sites. It's not going out to the far edge. If you want to push something out and run it on the cell site, the cost point, the power consumption, etc., and the business case better be extremely strong. Excuse me, how do I go back? Sorry. So how far out do we push this within the network? It's really those aggregation sites where we have many different projects looking at that first level of aggregation, both for fixed and for mobile. We're working on trials and looking at how we distribute it further, but that data center today looks very similar as it did previously. However, when we start to look at the far edge, the conversation is very different. Then you're typically talking to the network department, not the data center department. They have different requirements. They're looking at how they integrate that very closely with segment routing. And when we run the data center session later in the week, you'll hear a lot about the different aspects of IT and telco. So the customer example that I just wanted to look at for this is Rakuten. And I wasn't sure whether to do this in the 5G section or to do this here. But for us, this is huge. We announced this at Mobile World Congress 2 weeks ago. So what they've done is they've built out an IPv6 segment routing-based infrastructure. They're starting to build this out. They're going to launch in October in Japan. They're a new entry to 4G. The key thing is they're building this infrastructure 10 years after everybody else launched 4G. Now, by building out a new architecture, they estimate they can be a quarter of the price of the existing people within that market. But critically, what they've done is they're opening up the radio. To the discussion and the question we had before, they're doing virtualized RAN, where we have a baseband unit and a remote head end, and the baseband unit is fully virtualized and software-based. And we have a white paper that describes exactly the model and how they're deploying. So they're deploying this today, or they're going to be deploying this year, but all of the infrastructure is 5G ready, so they can start to add in that remote infrastructure. So Cisco are providing all of the data center infrastructure, all of the networking, all of the automation and virtualized packet core. We're working with Altiostar, who's our partner from the software control point for the Open vRAN, and Nokia are providing the cell sites. This controller is going to deploy to 4,000 sites. So it's hugely distributed within that infrastructure. Okay, so that was a little bit about and the Rakuten case. I'm sure you'll hear more about later in the week to go into more detail. I just wanted to finish with B2B. And what do we mean by B2B? So I mentioned that half of our revenue is B2B with our service provider customers to their end customers. So when you talk about Cisco ISRs, if you talk about Wi-Fi, if you talk about intent-based networking, we have two models. Now, what's really disrupted this market is SD-WAN, software-defined WAN. Now, initially, this was a play by new entrants in the market to come in and say, well, you don't need those expensive VPNs. Here's a software-based overlay infrastructure. You can now start to use internet connectivity and control your traffic. But actually, it's much more than that. This allows you the flexibility to apply policy, to use your MPLS VPN infrastructure, but then to use other infrastructure that becomes available. And this is why it's so interesting when we start to talk about 5G. We have two solutions. They fit in slightly different places. So Meraki, if the end customer wants to manage this themselves, or some service providers are offering their own operations on top of Meraki to deploy it. But this sort of fits in commercial and some public sectors, universities, etc. Very successful for us, but it tends to be the smaller customers. If it's large enterprises, if they're large multinationals where they want to build out this infrastructure, then we have Viptela and a fully integrated solution that we can allow that to go out to launch new services on top of. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of Viptela, but it's essentially an overlay network. It's not dependent on the infrastructure that it's running on. We have the vEdge, and we have the ability to run Viptela endpoints both within Cisco ISRs, within the Viptela router platform, or even run it on white box or a virtualized software function running on x86. But then we have a management solution that sits on top of this that allows you to build out that infrastructure in a virtualized way, to route the traffic over the most appropriate links, to provide high SLAs, but then to link in with the services at the back end. So I mentioned about our customers consuming from the cloud, SaaS providers, them consuming from cloud providers such as AWS or Microsoft Azure, or from the own service provider infrastructure and data center. And this provides them with the flexibility to do that. On top of that, we have the MSX platform. This allows them to build the customer interaction so customers can go in and self-provision, and we can provide different levels of control, as well as add that service and innovation on top. So I wanted to give a customer example. We announced 2 months ago with Vodafone, so Vodafone Global, deploying SD-WAN. We have many other customers. Orange have gone public, BT have gone public, Verizon in the US have gone public on what they're deploying within this space. The key thing here is Vodafone, when they went public, said when they're deploying MPLS-based WAN services, it takes them 96 days. The way they've implemented the Viptela service, it takes them 10 hours to go out and implement that over the top. Now, they can couple that with their MPLS services, but then they can provide high-capacity offload with internet-based services, or if it's a site where they can't get MPLS VPN-based services too, it gives them much more flexibility. They're not limited to Vodafone's own infrastructure. they can deploy this over anybody's infrastructure within this space. But I just wanted to point out a survey that Cisco did around what are enterprise customers looking for, our enterprise customers. And what they really want from the service providers is to extend their security, their policy, and the profiling that they do for their internal and their customers to the service provider infrastructure. How can they take all of the security policies for the connected devices, and if they're sitting on the end of Wi-Fi, if they're sitting on the end of 4G or 5G or SD-WAN, how do they achieve that? And what we're doing for 5G is we're looking at SD-WAN integration with our packet core technology. So what that allows the service provider to do is to open up the APIs on their packet core and allow end customers to provision SD-WAN over 5G, over fiber, over MPLS VPN, any of the infrastructure. But because 5G is going to offer very high speed to new locations, this will allow enterprise customers to rapidly extend that same look and feel and policy to those new locations. I'm going to skip the security slide. Okay, so I've been through a lot. I wanted to give you a taste of what's the story with our service provider customers, what's going on with 5G. You're going to hear a lot more about SP networking, data center, and B2B. The final thing I just wanted to comment on is the way that we're engaging with our customers and the way that we want to engage with you and the way that you need to engage with your customers. I mentioned this barrier to entry with the technology. We are engaging much more on developing on those APIs, doing co-development with our customers, going in, helping them code, and help them go on this journey. We have a dedicated agile development team in pre-sales where we go in and develop on top of these platforms. We're changing our skill set. We're training up and making sure that we can approach our customers in that different way. And we want to help you to be able to do that as well. Because if we don't change, and if we don't help our customers to change the way that they consume and use this technology, they're not going to be in a position to make the best of it. Okay, I'm 5 minutes over time, but are there any other questions?
If there are no questions in the room, there are a couple in the WebEx panel. I think the first one is from Ganjan Gandhi. I believe it's a little bit of about the strategy between two companies, right? Tricky one. Telco Cloud, why has there not been an approach to leverage better placed telco partners like Ericsson to partner towards SPs? I can see synergies between the two companies, between the company portfolio.
Very, very good question. So we announced a strategic partnership with Ericsson 3 years ago at Mobile World Congress. We absolutely, where it makes sense and where there's opportunities, will bid and work with Ericsson. And we have some, I think we're working, we've done things in access and aggregation with Ericsson. We've done things in the core of the network. Obviously, in just about every mobile service provider that we deploy in, Ericsson are often there providing the radios or other elements of the infrastructure. So we work with them every day. As regards us having packaged solutions, we've tried. We've done some of that together. I think Ericsson are going through some changes and are really focusing on how they can innovate and really get the radio right. And obviously, there's some areas that we overlap, but we absolutely would do more, and Ericsson are an important partner for us. It depends often on the local account team and often on the local relationship as to how we can work with them.
Okay, thanks, Adam. The second one is from Amos Rosenbaum again. How do you compare Cisco VPN VXLAN DC deployment to the ACI DC deployment in the SP market from a commercial adoption perspective?
In the IT space, absolutely. From an ACI perspective, we've had a huge amount of success. In the telco space, we see both. And you have the flexibility to go with a full ACI-enabled model from a provisioning and the way that you deploy it. And we think the ACI Anywhere model, the integration that we're doing with the cloud providers, is going to be really important in that space from an enablement point of view. But we know that some of our customers want to sort of get a common baseline, and they want to build their own orchestration and automation, almost use their own way of deploying that with SDN. And that is absolutely a valid model. You don't get the advantages and the innovation and things that we're doing from an ACI perspective, but still, we will absolutely deploy on and support that model, and we support that with all of our infrastructure platforms. And we've opened up all those APIs to allow, if you want to build your own automation and orchestration solution and do this based on VXLAN directly, you absolutely can.
Any question in the room? I believe we should skip the break because we started 15 minutes late. If the audience don't have an issue with that, we will continue with the next.
I would give them 5 minutes. It's boiling in here.
5 minutes by break, and then we come back.
It's not fair.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. I'll be around this morning, so any other questions, please let me know. Thank you. Here.